All right, we are live. Welcome, comrades. Thank you for joining us today for this stream where we're going to be looking at why we need to explicitly uphold communism in the 21st century and how we can proceed with a scientific socialist analysis that learns from and corrects the errors of the past while mapping out a clear pathway forward for communists right now. Today, we are exceptionally fortunate to be joined by Dr. Joshua Moufawad-Paul, a professor of philosophy at York University, Canada, well known in left-wing circles for his books like Continuity and Rupture, The Communist Necessity, and more recently, Critique of Maoist Reason. You may recognise his voice from his regular appearances on Revolutionary Left Radio with Brett O'Shea, where he and Brett add some much-needed clarity to a variety of theoretical topics that many of us, myself included, struggle with. So, Josh, thank you for taking the time out to join the stream today, comrade. Please introduce yourself to the audience, telling the people about your political work, your writing, and your academic work.
Oh, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show. It's exciting. Hopefully, because it's live, I won't make some kind of gaffe or something. But anyhow, people know me and know what my name is, and I guess some people or maybe other people don't. But yeah, I do. I'm contract faculty at York University. I'm a professor of philosophy. I've written a number of books on political philosophy, specifically about kind of Maoism and Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. I mean, that is, I guess, it is the tendency I identify with politically and theoretically. And in terms of that, I've been like a long time organizer. I definitely don't want to talk about specific organizational work maybe on live, but I have been, people who have I think I've been open up about my kind of trajectory from having been at one point an anarchist, moving more towards Marxism and eventually Maoism. And I talk about that in The Communist Necessity and some other stuff on my blog as well. But I've had that long time experience of organizing, and recently I support in the place where I live, the settler capitalist formation of Canada, I support the Revolutionary Communist Party of Canada, not to be confused with the Revolutionary Communist Party of the USA. I'm a supporter of that organization and its many ups and downs that it's had. And yeah, that's, I guess, about all of what I can say about myself at this moment. And hopefully what I say will be useful. I mean, as I mentioned to you before, Paul, the title of this, Correcting the Socialism of the 20th Century, very ambitious title. I definitely am not someone as an individual who can correct that. Right? Maybe
it's a tall order.
Definitely interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a tall order for today. And by the way, interesting call out of Canada. Hopefully our Canadian comrades aren't too heartbroken by that one. And yeah, absolutely. Please, comrades, go ahead and check out MLM Mayhem as well, your blog. You'll find a link to that in the description box below. You'll find links to where you can find our comrades' books and all that good stuff. You'll find that in the description box below. You'll also be able to find a way to follow him on Twitter. So you'll find the handle. I think it's MLM_Mayhem. That's the handle on Twitter. So yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. I know this is going to be a really, really interesting and informative stream. Maybe we won't be able to answer all of these problems that we have with 20th century socialism. We might not be able to rectify and correct everything, but we'll certainly do our best. So let's do what we can. We've got about, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. Let's do what we can within that time frame and see where it goes. So brilliant. So picking up from there, I'm a member of the Connolly Youth Movement. Shout out to the comrades from the Connolly Youth Movement who are checking this out now, which is a Marxist-Leninist socialist Republican organisation for people across the 32 counties of Ireland between the ages of 16 and 30. Now, we've recently been experiencing an uptick of interest in the organisation, with more and more young people becoming interested in communism. But for those who are a bit more on the fence ideologically, maybe those who lean left but who haven't fully pinned down their own ideology yet, why should progressives explicitly be communists and embrace scientific socialism?
Well, I guess, I can start as simple, then of course I'm going to get into this in more detail. It's such a big question, right? And anyhow, simply put, the history of revolutionary communism has provided us with the lessons about how to organize, how to succeed in making revolution, and what roadblocks and errors we will encounter. And I've argued for a long time, both on my blog or in person or in my books, that we need to return to the conception of historical materialism as a science, both as a science of history and a science of making revolution. When we understand that historical materialism generates truth procedures like other sciences, but that these are always open to the future, we'll be able to see the social historical laboratory in which the science was tested and developed. And this will stop us from seeing Marxism, like other social theories, as just a random collection of different doctrines and tendencies, with different authors and different innovators, where this kind of perspective allows us to merely pick and choose what combinations we like. The point that I want to get to is that, like any other science, instead we can see the theoretical terrain of Marxism as something that has unfolded over time, transformed in its own discrete laboratory, and that's the laboratory of class struggle, and that it has generated truth processes as much as it has generated mistakes, failures, and pseudoscientific tendencies, just as physics, biology, and chemistry, which are usually what people take to be like the reference of science, right?
Hard sciences,
right? I would say the so-called hard science.
Yeah.
Biology and chemistry, right? They generate like the same things: mistakes, failures, and pseudoscientific tendencies. But a good physicist or biologist, like they don't just pick and choose eclectically from various past tendencies in their field. In fact, if they did so, they'd be accused of being poor scientists, and that sometimes happens quite a bit, right? So there's a number of contemporary biologists who have, who eclectically combine disproven phrenology with acceptable DNA search, and other people in the field rightly call them pseudoscientists, and and racist pseudoscientists at that. So that kind of holds. I think that kind of approach, what I'm getting at, holds with historical materialism. This idea of moving systematically and non-eclectically through the scientific understanding. So the best way to think historical materialism in this perspective, and again, this is all goes back to the question of like why it's important for people to accept this as kind of a perspective of going forward for changing the world. And I embarked on this kind of way of thinking about historical materialism years ago, while being an activist and an organizer, moving from various perspectives, like moving from having been an anarchist in that kind of globalization movement perspective, and seeing the limits of that, and seeing that all that it's like going back to the question of what is to be done, right? And then moving into more kind of because of all the Cold War propaganda that was like, oh, I can't touch Marxism, Leninism, or let alone Maoism. Woo, I eventually ended up there by doing a lot of studying and also just a lot of activism and being around different organizers and things like that. And so I moved from these various perspectives, grew up and learned. And so with that, I think the best way to think historical materialism is by understanding that its foundational scientific axiom is that history is a history of class struggle. Right. And once we see that as its axiom, right, as its foundational, it's the idea that's the motion of the science. That's the motion it kind of talk about, the motion of history. Right. And once we see that, we can ask how it is developed through class struggle, and if it has generated universalizable truth procedures, which all scientists do. They generate kind of a truth that is universalizable, that in all contexts is correct, right? And that's a qualification for anything that can be called scientific, right? And so the question is, has it developed these things, these universalizable truth procedures in the course of its development? And it has, right? We have what Samir Amin has called world historical revolutions that are the result of organizing movements based on the perspective of historical materialism. Movements that could provide concrete analyses of their concrete situations, uncovering the mechanics of their social contexts, and then do the painstaking work of organizing revolutionary sequences. These sequences applied the lessons of previous sequences, repeated the successes, and overcame the failures, leading to new insights. And since the most recent world historical revolution, and that's the Chinese Revolution under Mao Zedong, we now have a set of universal insights that tell us what works and what doesn't. We've seen failure to pull off revolutions time and time again by refusing to implement what the revolutions, these world historical revolutions, have proven were necessary for making revolution. And I realize I'm glossing over a lot here, but I've written essays and books on this topic, and so I'll just shamelessly self-promote that if read my stuff.
Shout out to the Communist Necessity, Continuing Rupture, Demarcation, Demystification.
It's available for free too, so it's not like you're contributing to my retirement plan. I mean, my books definitely do not do that. Okay. Anyhow, going back to this thing about what I just said about the revolution and thing like that, and the scientific understanding, just to rein it back, I also want to point out that just because we have this perspective of a scientific understanding of revolutionary communism and its importance and why we should be communist, this doesn't mean, I want to be clear, that we can't learn from other theoretical traditions or even other dead-end Marxist trajectories. Striving, and it's important always, and I think this is essential to Mao. I mean, are things that Mao himself said quite a bit. There's a whole strain in his talk about avoiding dogmatism, and yet I think dogmatism is this thing that, and I've talked about this again, that people who become communists, especially when they're younger and not reading a lot, they fall into dogmatism quite a bit. So I mean, that's another issue altogether. But I just want to emphasize that striving against dogmatic Puritanism is important. And the great revolutionaries like Lenin and Mao always read and learned from other traditions and thinkers. I mean, but what they did is they would transform these insights. Like, I mean, Lenin read from a bunch when he was writing Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So he read a lot of other thinkers that some of them weren't Marxist, right? And some of them were actually liberals, and he took what their insights and he was able to run them through kind of a historical materialist analysis and like kind of reorient them to like an actual proper scientific analysis of imperialism. But that work was important, and we know that Marx read Ricardo and Smith and all these people, right? So, the point is that as long as the general universal insights from these world historical revolutions have established, these insights that these world historical revolutions have established are correct, buttressing them from insights from a variety of other non-Marxist, quasi-Marxist, or different Marxist theoretical tendencies is definitely important. At best, there's insights that can illuminate the general established universal axioms. At worst, we can end up with a critique of these other tendencies that can help us understand inversely how to proceed. It's like these tendencies, if we really take them seriously, we can be, this is why they're shit, but of course, there's always a temptation to have an eclectic approach to this, and that's why I always emphasize this kind of what you said, scientific socialism, right? And so we always have this temptation. It's eclectic, and we can become enamored by a whole array of different theoretical conceptions. And we want to try to create something new. And often that something new we want to create just becomes repetition of older attempts that lead us nowhere, right? And so it's important, right, to around this weather while we study and understand things, to have this basis of communism as scientific socialism and a historical materialist kind of framework in order to avoid this error. So, as this kind of just end talking a little bit about these eclectic approaches, because, the other approaches you might take instead of being communist, right? Many of these end up rejecting the notion of a revolutionary party as quite common, right? Or implying that we should work in some radical reformist way. And we know that these approaches lead nowhere to overthrowing the current state of affairs, right? Movement. I call this movementism. I didn't invent this term; other people did. I mean, I use it. Some people apply. I'd say that I came up with it in the Communist Necessity, but it was actually a term that was current in our activist circles, right? As a critique, a pejorative for social movementism. So movementism, that's the perspective that all small autonomous movements will contribute to the spontaneous overthrow of capitalism, right? Just spontaneously contribute, not through any kind of organized, overarching disciplinary structure, right? And we need to get it's an abdication of revolutionary science, right? That kind of view. So if we give up on this kind of scientific socialism or communism, we either get a default anarchism or some kind of reformism from either a traditional reformist one or a movementist one. And both of these approaches have, history has told us that they have never led to any kind of revolutionary transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like, unfortunately, these strategies just don't work. They never have, and there's that old saying which comes to mind, and I think it's often misattributed to Einstein. It's not actually he didn't actually say this, but it's that old saying, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Unfortunately, this seems to be the case, when it comes to movementism and these various eclectic approaches that fail to harness historical materialism,
but it could also apply to Marxism, Leninism too, right? Like the way that the same, like the idea that it should be, when I say it's scientific, it should be open to the future and development and learn what was success and not repeat the same failures over and over again as well. So I mean, we're definitely guilty of that too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, leading on from that question, or from that point, in the wake of the Connolly Youth Movement breaking away from the Communist Party of Ireland, young comrades from all over the world have been getting in touch with me and sympathising with their struggles within the party, and specifically sympathising with struggles that they've also been having with their own organisations or their parent organisations' interpretation and implementation of democratic centralism. There's more and more stories coming out at the moment regarding abuses of power in these organisations. And this to me suggests that the problems encountered by comrades around the world are not just isolated incidents, bad apples or whatever, but perhaps are indicative of larger issues within Marxism-Leninism that need to be addressed, confronted, and overcome rather than shied away from and brushed under the rug. So, let's talk a little bit about what might be giving rise to these issues. What are the general limits of Marxism-Leninism?
Well, I mean, first, before getting into those issues and the issues that this question is about and that you indicated, I want to be careful here because what I wrote about the general limits of Marxism-Leninism in Continuity and Rupture, I have a section called "The General Limits of Marxism-Leninism." That section has been, either misunderstood or misrepresented by some people, and I've always been interesting when I've seen people encountering and saying the same things about it, or that I've dismissed the Leninist Party, or I've dismissed Marxism-Leninism, and it's like something else. I've been like, that's not what I wrote. Maybe I could be accused of using some bad semantics here and there, but I want to be careful. First of all, going out right out the gate, some things I want to say about this, and also this, I guess, we'll connect it back to that whole scientific socialist thing you're talking about with your question. So, I mean, Marxism-Leninism was the name by which revolutionary science developed and generated new insights. And defending it against the revisionism of Khrushchev, right, in that period, was necessary and foundational to the anti-revisionist communist movement, right? And so upholding Marxism-Leninism against Khrushchev's theory of peaceful coexistence, and this is like in the 60s and 70s, and that kind of period, it demarcated revolutionary communism as Marxism-Leninism rather than an anti-Leninist revisionist perspective that denied class struggle. So as a Maoist, I don't see Marxism-Leninism as wrong, right? I mean, there's a reason when I clarify what Maoist means, I also say MLM, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, just in the way, Leninism wouldn't say that Marxism was wrong, right? So I don't see Marxism-Leninism as wrong, but a moment in a sequence of revolutionary science that met certain limits that necessitated further qualitative scientific development, as Marxism did when it was transformed into Marxism-Leninism. In a very simple sense, right? Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, and Marxism-Leninism Maoism should be understood as identical and in continuity together with historical materialism as a revolutionary communist totality. But when we're talking about theoretical development, we end up, naming different sequences of the science to chart this development. Right? So when we speak of limits with Marxism-Leninism, and that's just back to that, it's not about scrapping Leninism, let alone Marxism, but speaking of the real historical limits they encountered and the ways in which revolutionary science was able to transgress those limits through practice and organization. And that's the laboratory of class struggle. So the Maoist sequence, it's not a pure rupture from Marxism-Leninism, as some have claimed I've made this claim, this doctrine of pure rupture. It's not seeing the dialectic of continuity and rupture identical in the way that I'm talking about, right? It's not a pure rupture from Marxism-Leninism, but a rupture from its limits, so as to establish a new continuity and preserve both Marxism and Leninism within a new stage that goes qualitatively further. I mean, this is language of continuity and rupture. Lenin used it, Mao used it as well when they're just talking about development, right? I mean, you think about a development, if you think about things developing to a higher stage, the next staircase is in continuity with the previous one because it's built with it, right? Built on top of it, but it's also in discontinuity. It's not the same level, right? So you just kind of think of these kind of metaphors, or like the spiral metaphor as opposed to the circle, which is, the one that Lenin and Mao would have used when they talk about continuity and rupture. And if we want to look at this, then to talk more about kind of like the limits here, and this gets into the kind of, I guess, the meat or the substance of your question and these problems that have been encountered with poor uses of democratic centralism, right? And that happens in all org. And also, I want to put it as a side, it's funny that a lot of anarchist organizations have poor uses of things. They say they don't have democratic centralism, but they make the same mistakes, but they don't have an analysis for it, right? They don't call it that. This is a side point, because I've been in past, before I was an anarchist, just looking back, and they're like, oh, we're so anti-authoritarian, but there's always some dude who's like a organization.
A rose by any other name, as they say.
saying that, but the idea about democratic centralism is it's supposed to be a mechanism that we know and we can understand, and it has been abused, right? So if we look at this kind of concept of the revolutionary organization in which DC democratic centralism will be implemented, we can look at its development over a course of time. So let's look at Marx and Engels, right? They established that there should be a proletarian party, not a party for justice and all of humanity, right? The break from the League of the Just and the establishment of the Communist League, like Engels did that speech where he pretty much says that it's not for all humanity. There is an antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, so it's not about the humanity of the bourgeoisie, right? It's so they had this whole notion that the party should be based on the general antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and that all humans are not siblings in a class divided society, right? So that's this insight when we start going with the notion of a party that will eventually have democratic centralism and all those kind of vanguard conception and all that. So the Leninist conception of this notion represented a qualitative shift by proposing that such a party must be a vanguard party. So not only just about the proletariat, right, but that it could not organize the proletariat class as a whole, but must begin with the most advanced detachment of that class. And this was, I remember this was in continuity with the original Marxist notion because it preserved the conception of the general antagonism and the need for a party, but it was also a ruptural moment because it went further. It was not a rupture in the sense that it broke completely from what Marx and Engels proposed, but instead proposed a qualitative shift in our understanding of the party. And retrospectively, that established continuity with Marx and Engels by finding aspects in what they wrote to justify the shift. But now we're hitting the general limits, right? So the vanguard party with democratic centralism. But this conception, it eventually encounters limits because it conceived of the vanguard as a general staff of the proletariat, right? In this kind of way, where you would have this kind of a lot of the critiques that came out of the end of the new communist movement about the conception of the party and not being able to implement kind of a full Maoist view of things, and talking about there's too much monolithism and a top-down approach where there would be the leadership would use these mechanisms hypocritically of democratic centralism and things like that, and be like they were beyond criticism and you just had to implement what they said, and it resulted in commandism and the atrophy of the proposed vanguard from within. And I think that required, I know that required a further development. Maoism it proposes the vanguard party, it should still be a vanguard, still have democratic centralism, but it should be conceptualized according to the mass line, from the masses to the masses. And this idea that the leadership is not beyond criticism, right? And the leadership should be humble and realize that it can make mistakes and that the masses may outpace the party itself even at some moments. And it's a ruptural moment only insofar as it is a qualitative development of the same continuity of the party, vanguard party, right? It preserves this, I think this view, it preserves the notion of the vanguard party, it preserves the notion of the proletarian party, it preserves both Marxism and Leninism, and both notions of the party should not be for all humanity, not for all of the working class, while proclaiming that such a vanguard force can only be a vanguard by maintaining a circuit with the masses. It proposes that a vanguard party, though a necessary organizational form, can become alienated from the masses, and also is able, provides a theory for understanding how it becomes alienated from the masses, right? Gives you that scientific explanation, explanatory depth, right? As I say in my critical thinking classes when we talk about importance of scientific thinking. So it can become alienated from the masses and must be further developed to be in relation with the masses. And just as Leninism, I'd say, it was able to preserve continuity with Marxism in its articulation of the party vanguard, Maoism is able to preserve continuity in its articulation of the vanguard with the mass line. So Maoism is thus Marxism-Leninism, just as Marxism-Leninism is Marxism, which means Maoism is also Marxism. And we can understand a scientific continuity through moments of rupture, but ruptural moments that express fidelity to the science and are not pure discontinuities anymore than the Einsteinian paradigm is a pure discontinuity from the Newtonian paradigm. And I think I end here, just to get back to this notion of limits and transgressing limits. There's a great quote from Mao where he writes, "Dialectical materialism holds that the appearance of a new form, a new characteristic, or a new category arises from a rupture in the continuity and the passage through a leap resulting from a clash and a breakthrough. But at the same time, the continuity and the reciprocal links between things can definitely not be absolutely demolished." That's what I have to say.
Oh man, you hit me right in the fucking political organizing there quite a few times actually, especially when you were talking about sort of the issues with regard to accountability and leadership and all of these kinds of problems. I know this is an issue that comrades in Ireland have bumped up against quite recently with the Communist Party of Ireland, and was one of the reasons why there was that rupture, I suppose, with the old way, the old Communist Party, and I suppose now we've got to carve out this new path forward in front of us. And so I think that this sort of necessitates engaging with these new ideas and critically understanding what went wrong and how we can correct those problems rather than sort of brushing them under the rug and then ultimately dooming ourselves to committing the same errors in the future. So thank you very much for adding so much clarity to this question and for bringing it out. I think it's going to be really, really useful for a lot of comrades who are checking this out. So we can see some of the problems here. We've talked about some of the problems within Marxism-Leninism, but moving forward from that, within like the 1960s, 1970s, you saw a lot of this kind of anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism. I'm thinking like, now I can never pronounce this name correctly, okay, so excuse me, but like Hodgism or Hodgism, I don't know, Enver Hoxha and stuff like that. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly correctly, but correct me if you do know the correct way of saying it.
Yeah,
But
it's like one of those like a Hoxha.
Hoxha. Okay, Hodgism and the likes. Why not just anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism? Why not just Hodgism or something like that? Because there was a lot of organizations who recognized a lot of these problems that seem to be popping up all over the world within Marxist-Leninist organizations, even back then, like 50 years ago. So why can't we just do that now?
Well, at this conjuncture, and I think I was kind of maybe I was just talking around it earlier, right? Discussed it earlier. When I talk about like kind of scientific sequences, right? We've passed the point of a simple anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism. At one point, in the point that you go back in the same time where like people got called Hoxites or Hoxists or whatever. At one point Maoism meant people called themselves Maoism in the 60s and 70s. It meant anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism, which is why it went by the name of Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And so this Mao Zedong thought qualifier, it was intended to indicate that Marxism-Leninism was the science, but that the anti-revisionism gleaned through the Chinese Revolution with Mao as its thinker was merely a corrective of Marxism-Leninism against Khrushchevite revisionism at that time, right? It came out in the response to Khrushchev's claim of a peaceful coexistence. There were, the Sino-Soviet split, siding with the Chinese against the Soviets. So a number of problems with it, because a lot of times, a lot of these groups, one of the limits they met was just because their stuff was so geopolitically based that it just became parroting anything China did, and seeing things just on this level of of a world play out of politics, as opposed to actually like defending the science and thinking about how to apply it to their own circumstances. Not all of them, but you saw this happening a lot. But also at that time there were other contenders to anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism. A big one would have been, you brought it up, like Enver Hoxha's he kind of had this austere vision of Marxism-Leninism. But I would argue, and I know people that would define themselves to the Hoxha strain that might be annoyed with me about this, but they know I would say this anyhow. I think Hoxhism is largely rejection of scientific development and is based on upholding Lenin and Stalin, like only on upholding them against the Khrushchevite turn, not on thinking through kind of a further development of historical materialism. And it doesn't admit further development in its conceptualization beyond the Leninism expressed by Stalin. You can see this even the way that Hoxha, when Albania breaks from China, you can see with Hoxha's like kind of criticisms of the Cultural Revolution show almost this horror that something different could be happening against the party or something like that. And that was at the revolutionary height of the Cultural Revolution, right? So that austere kind of preservationist in the old way, like just like keep like a conservative. I want to say politics might not have been conservative as we understand them, but it was a conservationist attitude, like a conservative attitude to theory, right?
Let's go back.
Yeah, so unless we get the term conservative from, trying to conserve the past, right? So Hoxha's understanding could not admit further development beyond the Leninism expressed by Stalin, and it really hasn't ever done so. And it's largely concerned with defending Marxism-Leninism against revisionist deviations, but without agreeing that there could be further development, right? which is largely unscientific, since science, by definition, can and should develop. It's not merely about protecting what has been correct in past periods. So, considering that the Chinese Revolution went further than the Russian Revolution, and thus was another world historical revolution, the fact that Hojists do not recognize this means that they are not thinking according to the boundaries of the very science they seek to defend. Now, look, I mean, I uphold Enver Hoxha's political line in Albania against the counter-revolution. Sure, but let's be clear here, right? There was nothing in the Albanian revolutionary sequence that was a new world historical development. We see such a world historical development in China, which Hoxha refused to recognize, while it's sorry, I'm a mind blank here. I've lost my train of thought. So we see such a world historical development in China, right? And that world historical development, it understood the failures of the Soviet Union that led directly to Khrushchev, and it transgressed them, but also met its own failures. And in any case, the science eclipsed, kind of the Hoxhist view of things, and they didn't grasp this eclipse. All of this is to say, the messy way that I've come about it is, that there really cannot be an anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism that is not also Maoism. If we want to think the development of revolutionary science, we must think it through its revolutionary sequences and the meaning of the last world historical revolution, not last but not final, the meaning of the last but not final world historical revolution in China. And this leads us to the question of Maoism. So conceiving Maoism as a specific stage, I mean, this happens later after the fall of, this is why I talk about continuity rupture, like, decades after the fall of like Mao's line in China. And so conceiving Maoism as a specific stage, it emerges with the People's War in Peru, carried out by the PCP, and then the initiation of the Revolutionary International Movement, of which, the Communist Party of Peru is a part. This turn in theory was based on the assessment of the Chinese Revolution and the explosion of people's wars and international struggles influenced by the Chinese Revolution. So while earlier movements might have claimed the name Maoism, this was largely, like I said, as a stand-in for an anti-revisionist Mao Zedong thought that was meant to justify simply Marxism-Leninism. And there were some groups that did try to claim that Maoism was a new stage back in the 70s, but I mean, and Badiou, like Alain Badiou was in a group like that. But now you can see how Alain Badiou has drifted to this post-Maoist kind of world view. But these groups, they could barely justify this claim, and a large part of their work was eclectic and confused.
Knocking it out of the park there, shattering worldviews with every word. Yeah, I don't even know what to say to that. It just absolutely smashed.
Are we correcting the problems of 20th century socialism?
Oh my god! Like any good scientific endeavor, you're throwing up so many more questions than it seems like we're solving. Because it's like, well, what then? What do we do? How do we move forward? But I do think that you brought up a lot of really important points. We do need to move beyond these problems. It's not enough to just say there are problems. We actually need to be able to move beyond them and to move forward. So how does Marxism, Leninism, Maoism offer a clear path forward for communists who've bumped up against these limitations of Marxist-Leninist organizing?
That's a big question. And I mean, again, to shamelessly plug the communist necessity. Or others like that. But I mean, also I'm a philosopher, and part of my work that I've always warned about is that, like, I kind of, the way I conceive of the practice of philosophy is to kind of bring clarity to the stuff that's proved through the revolutionary practice of different organizations. So I'm not the one that develops this kind of organizational theory, definitely, but I can draw a few things based on what I study, but it's not going to be the best answer is if you spoke to representative of the NPA or something. So okay, so I mean, the qualifications that I have, but how does Marxism, Leninism, Maoism offer a clear path forward for communists who have bumped up against the limitations of Marxist-Leninist organizing? That's what you asked. So aside from offering an analysis of the limits of revolution and what needs to be transgressed to go further, I think there's the Maoist conception of the mass line and its strategic conception of protracted people's war. And these are insights that need to be incorporated into a revolutionary movement that seeks to overthrow the current state of affairs. The notion that the Maoist party renews itself in the masses, that it must continuously prove itself as a vanguard, and that it can even be challenged by the masses, right? And this all goes back to the stuff you asked, I think, 2 questions ago about the problem of DC and the ossification of the party, right? I mean, this is it's that question, that thing kind of, this partly answers your question too about the importance of this internal organizational structure, right? The party renewing itself in the masses, continuously proving itself as the vanguard, the notion that it can even be challenged by the masses. This offers a way out of commandism that can and has happened within traditional Marxist-Leninist parties, as we've discussed, the kind of commandism, the abuses of DC. I mean, this doesn't mean, of course, that the same kind of commandism or other organizational errors won't happen amongst Maoist formations, right? I mean, it can happen as long as people become shitty liberals and take on these attitudes. Right? The difference is, Maoism has a theoretical explanation as to why it happens, as well as a theory for how to overcome these errors. It's very easy that someone could be in a Maoist party and know all these things and have a total gap between theory and practice and never implement what needs to be overcome them, right? I mean, that's the problem we can have with anyone who falls into shitty liberal behavior. But I mean, we're just talking about the theory to explain how they happen and the theory how to overcome these errors. I think here I would just probably lean on other people that have done good work. And Ajit, he wrote he has two great articles on this, the Maoist Party and the Vanguard of the 21st Century. They're both in his book collection of essays that Foreign Languages Press put out, and I think which is also available for free as a PDF, because Foreign Languages Press puts everything out as free as a PDF. I think they're great essays, and they're great resources for this approach to the party concept. So I'm not going to go on too much there because I could say a lot about that. And then also similarly, I think the strategic conception of protracted people's war breaks from the simple pattern of insurrectionism inherited from the Bolshevik Revolution, that outside of the Bolshevik Revolution hasn't amounted to much. And this has been written on a bunch before. I think, though, one of the problems we have to be careful about this, about people's war, is it's become now kind of a little bit of an adage for people in the Maoist camp to say protracted people's war is universal, or protracted people's war towards communism, and all these slogans. But I mean, the application of the theory of it for advanced capitalist countries, or even semi-advanced capitalist countries, or any other kind of context, it needs to be developed further, right? People need to work on it. But I think what I think is clear to me philosophically, I've written about this, is that insurrectionism actually cannot answer the question of strategy that people's war can, right? But the question of how do you tactically apply that strategy in various contexts is one that still requires much more work. But anyhow, when we look at what is going on so far, right, I think we can see the superiority in this approach of organization strategy when we look at the people's wars that have happened, some of which are still happening under the banner of Maoism. Right. So, I mean, we can go back to for instance, you had, the PCP, the Communist Party of Peru, the so-called Shining Path. They advanced rather quickly towards strategic equilibrium before hitting a major setback while applying Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. And this is right in the period that this happens, which is monumental, is right after the fall of the Eastern Bloc and the claim that capitalism is the end of history. Right? Yeah. You have people declaring that Maoism is a new stage when all the imperialist discourse is communism is over, and going rapidly through a revolutionary moment before hitting the setback, right? And then you have pretty quickly after there, or it kind of not really after, it kind of happens it overlaps, but then goes further is the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, right? They launch a people's war that goes even further, but the CPN Maoist, it encounters precisely what its own theory warned it about: revisionist counter-revolution from within the organization, specifically from the leadership, which is, of course, exactly, I mean, and that's why the failure of the CPN Maoists, I was watching that nearly, the great strides they made, but this failure where the leadership basically betrayed the masses and went into this peace project where every other Maoist group was follow your theory through, right? People's war, keep doing it. They were no, we can do this. And then, it became tragic. And part of this tragedy, and especially the leadership's betrayal, was that it had already been conceptualized even by the CPN Maoists as something that could possibly lead to their failure. And then they went and did it, right? I mean, there's a great book. I mean, I know I'm going on a tangent, but Hisala Yami's book on people's war and women's liberation in Nepal, Salayami, or also known as Comrade Parvati, she was in leadership, and she eventually ended up in the shitty camp that accepted went to the right line, the rightist line, that ended that organization and made it a different organization, leagued with revisionists and just a parliamentary party. But before that, when she was still kind of a revolutionary, she wrote this book that actually, when she was talking about the way that leadership functioned, that a certain level in that society, because of semi-feudal privilege and caste privilege that existed, that the people that would rise to the ranks of the leadership would be men that had less, men in that society, in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society, that would have less to lose by going reformist, right? And that was her argument for the need for autonomous women organizations to take over leadership positions. So she said that if this doesn't happen, then the leadership will capitulate. And what happens is, she was one of the few women in it, but she, as part of it, they capitulated. So it was a weird kind of moment on that. Anyhow, that was a tangential view. But I mean, those are the ones that, these roadblocks. And, there's different splinter groups of the CPN Maoists that are still exist and have gone back into armed struggle, but are not the same level that power that the CPN Maoist had at a certain time. But still, that was a moment that showed us wow, this is happening, right? Mm-hmm. And there's the ongoing people's wars in the Philippines and India. And the Philippines is this high level of organization, right? Mm-hmm. A level of organization that, every time people comment on it, they're or they know anything about it, they're yeah, this is way beyond anything any other first world communist organization has. And India too, the India what has been ever, right? Mm. There's also Maoist mass movements in Afghanistan and Brazil, right? And all of these, they function at a higher level of revolutionary politics and practice than anything that other Marxist-Leninist tendencies, let alone non-Marxist tendencies, have produced since the Chinese Revolution. And it's the thing is that whenever I bring up these people's wars and Maoist movements, to say look what they're doing, it's the knee-jerk response is kind of this complaint, well, but they aren't victorious, right? See, they haven't yet claimed victory. They've been doing that for 20 years, right? Or not longer, going through different it's longer for the party of the Philippines, right? They went through different rectification movements over a long period from
50 years now or something.
Yeah, they had a 50-year anniversary last year. Yeah, but it's because they had to go through different rectification movements, different shifts, right? The world situation changed, and I mean that's the point. Because if you look at the world after the fall of the Eastern Bloc, right, and the monstrous growth of imperialist power and the military technologies that maintain this power, it's not at all like the world in which the Soviet Union came into being, or the world in which China came into being after China came into being using the elements of World War II and what it had been able to do against, pitting imperialists against each other as strength to organize, right? I mean, it was definitely hard, and they started small against things, but there were these moments of, and they also had the socialist bloc, right? They could support each other until the famous Sino-Soviet split. And before that, the Russian Revolution had, people hated the Tsar, and, they were able to use the very unpopular World War I in order to split, the soldiers, right? And that's the famous, insurrectionary movement. They were able to organize before that because that situation and the technology was so different, right? After this declaration of the New World Order and the arms race that resulted from the Cold War, and then the fall of the Eastern Bloc, right? We should instead be seeing how amazing it is that these movements, these people's wars now, have advanced at all, and that some of them have been able to keep reproducing their forces despite brutal counterinsurgencies and surveillance technologies and all this kind of thing that have developed in this kind of strength that imperialism has that it didn't have in these past ones, right? And also, so that's the one thing, right? It's a different world situation. We're still seeing advancement. And of course, the more people that get on that platform will be able to, advance it further, right? And I mean, what is the alternative anyhow? When people say, "Oh, they don't have victory yet," I mean, well, the one alternative we know is the movementist notion of spontaneous rebellions. And all those spontaneous rebellions that we see, as much as we should defend every spontaneous rebellion of the masses against injustices as correct, right? Because it's right to rebel. But we know, just on a strategic level, that they don't work at overthrowing the system. In fact, they're rapidly pacified. Then there can be the other side is a celebration of this old revisionist Marxist-Leninist parties that exist already, right? Because there's a bunch of them in the world, and they're large and they're stable, right? They're able to have a lot of members. The Communist Party of Canada has a shitload of members. But the reason they're large and stable is because they're legal institutions that are not making revolution beyond rhetorical claims. Like, people can legally be members, and in fact, they don't have a clandestine leadership. They run in political elections. If they ever started like an actual kind of like deciding that they're going to get out in the streets and make revolution, the pigs would know exactly who their leadership is and be able to just arrest them en masse, right? So, I'm sure the pigs know a lot of other ones where people try to hide it because surveillance is so good, but in this one, it's just making it easy for them. That's the reason they're large and stable. They're not doing anything. They're not a threat, right? Look, one that always comes up is, the KKE in Greece, because even the revisionists here like them. They're like, how big they are. Look how they have so many organizations, and how they're embedded in a strong faction of the working class. But you know what? They're not organizing a clandestine armed wing because they prefer to function as a legal organization. And then I think, more importantly, when we look at these kind of old, stable revisionist parties, and I think a lot of them, they also tend, like, as we talk about kind of, historical materialism advancing and being able to take in new struggles of the masses and understand new struggles and come up with new theoretical apprehensions with the historical materialism to understand, the changes of history and things like that. The old stable revisionist parties, these legal institutions, they haven't developed much. Like, their theory is like, you read their theory, a large amount of it. They may have some individuals in their parties that have written good things themselves, right? They'll always have these kind of ideologues that will drift to them and will produce good work, but still be associated with a revisionist party. But that work will never be allowed to taint the program of the party that much, right? So you have these parties, they have a number of backwards conceptions, and the backwards conceptions should really disqualify them for being regarded as potential vanguard forces. Like, the idea of being part of a vanguard is to be the most advanced detachment of the proletariat. It means the most advanced views about every social issue, right? Or at least be trying to have those views and coming of them, right? If you don't, if your ideology like looks like something out of like the early 19th century with how you understand society, then it's I'd say not 19th, early 1900s, early 20th century. Then it's something going on wrong there. It's not like a living Marxism that you're doing, right? And so look at my context, right? The Communist Party of Canada. That's the first communist party. That is the traditional revisionist one. They actually went Khrushchevite before Khrushchev did. They still have the same intent, right? But then, for example, they do not hold that the colonized Indigenous nations of Canada qualify for national self-determination, although they're completely fine extending that right to Quebec, the French Canadian, province, right? Who were the losing colonizers of what would eventually become Canada, right? Quebec wasn't. They definitely were under a number back in the 60s and 70s. It's no denial that they were underneath a situation of Anglo-chauvinism, but they were only under that situation or even there because they also came to they were settler colonials too, and they came and they're pitiless and racist when it comes to like Indigenous land, just like Anglos are, right? So they would extend that to Quebec. Quebec were just the losing colonizers of what would eventually become Canada. But they don't extend this to Indigenous nations. Instead, they see Indigenous rights, right? They put it away as a civil rights issue within an imagined future socialist Canada. And which not only means that, and I'm using them as I think they're paradigmatic of a lot of these revisionist parties whose views are very outdated. It not only means that their analysis of their concrete situation is not concrete. They can't see Canada as a settler capitalist formation, but it puts them effectively behind the radical detachments of the Indigenous masses who are demanding their national sovereignty and who have historically done so through armed rebellions. In fact, Indigenous militants involved in anti-colonial struggle against Canada, they're light years beyond settler communist organizations when it comes to armed struggle, right? And it's like, it's not like communists haven't been doing this shit, like the colonized have been doing that here. And I'm tentative to talking about this, that, you're an Irish Republican as well. So you could maybe think about, the application of that there were communist organizations, and there still are, that don't see republicanism as a valid as the British, which is like backwards, right?
Yeah, totally.
Anyhow, Maoism, going back to this idea of these Indigenous militants involved in anti-colonial struggle, like Maoism would tell us that we should learn from them. Just as, and it's important, right? Mao argued, right? What he broke from like the kind of the revisionist view that was in his party, the ossified view, just do things in the city, general insurrection. And he went with a small working class that was in China. He broke from that. And he argued that we needed to learn, or that they, not we, I guess we know now, but that they needed to learn that from the peasant uprisings in Hunan, right? And went down there and reinitiated like a new communist party that actually became the Communist Party in China at the time. Okay, but the one about the indigenous stuff, struggles and things like that. That's example from my social context, and I think there's many other examples of how these large and stable revisionist parties as a whole, they're simply good at being legal entities and signing up members to be part of their legal trusteeship, but they lag behind the masses, and their theoretical outlook definitely does. Like back to the KKE, right? Very well organized, but they're a homophobic organization, right? They still uphold the heterosexual family, and they make the exact kind of homophobic arguments for it that reactionaries make and conservatives make in the U.S. And that Marxist-Leninists made, a number of Marxist-Leninist groups made in the 1960s, much to their detriment, which was seen as an error now. Like they lost, they lost a connection with like working class gay and lesbian forces, right? So those arguments, we should understand them as backwards now, that the KKE makes. But it's one thing for it to be backwards because people make backwards arguments. But if you're claiming to be the vanguard, you should be having these backwards views of society. You should have one of the most advanced views of society. And I think what happens is these backwards views have crept into these revisionist organizations because of how they've just become legal and detached from the masses, and the advanced detachment of the masses, the most radical elements of the masses. Anyhow, Maoism, to sum all this up, I know I've gone on many, many tangents.
Oh, no, they're not tangential at all for me. I mean, this is all just painfully relevant to what I've seen and what I've experienced, and it's really, really insightful.
Is good there. Anyhow, Maoism teaches us to learn from the most radical detachment of the masses and not to tail the broad masses as a whole, right? To locate the advanced, bring up the intermediate, and isolate the backwards while working to make revolution. And it's going to be a long and arduous process, and hence the notion of a protracted struggle. But when more and more organizations embark on this process with this kind of Maoist revolutionary mass line mindset, it's going to get less protracted. So, look, like just think about rebellions. Like rebellions are constantly erupting. And in most places in the world, these rebellions have nothing to do with an organized communist group. But they are, in so many cases, legitimate rebellions. And dismissing them because of their spontaneity, because they aren't being directed by a communist organization, that's an attitude, too, that Maoism teaches us to avoid. Once upon a time when communism, communist movements way in the past, before the Sino-Soviet split, or even directly after, right? Communism and the movements that were connected to the international, they possessed a level of strength that the communist parties would be the prime force in many of these rebellions, right? But this is no longer the case due to the fragmentation of communism, the defeat of the Eastern Bloc, right? So what Maoism teaches us in this, though, is that we can learn from these rebellions, that we can support them without trying to take them over, but that through the mass line, we can and should win the most militant factions of these rebellions over to our line, because just as they can teach us something about the world through their perspective, we have a theory of organization and making revolution that can invite them into a project of actually bringing revolutionary transformation into being instead of having these isolated rebellions.
Whew, powerful stuff right there. Honestly, I'm so outclassed in this conversation. I don't even feel like I can contribute anything tonight. It was just so on the ball. It was fantastic, and I really, really appreciate that. What would you say to comrades who suggest that everything you've suggested so far, everything that MLM offers, is already contained to some degree within Marxism-Leninism? Therefore, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism is unnecessary, that the mass line and people's war and all these kinds of things, they're already there. We don't need to move to a qualitatively higher stage. What do you say to these people?
Yeah, I mean, I've encountered this a lot. It's funny. It's kind of like a, this is why I don't argue online as much anymore, because some online talking point. I mean, when you argue with the masses, they don't even know about these distinctions that much, right?
It's not an issue.
Yeah, it's not like something at all. The issue is like, the violence of the police or the poverty or something. Anyhow, I mean, this whole notion that everything that MLM offers is contained within like ML, right? It's about as meaningful as the back to Marx folks, right? You always find them. It's like, we should ignore Leninism and Maoism because everything is Marx. Let's just go straight back to Marx, right? And they claim that, Leninism and Maoism have nothing to offer because anything worthwhile was already in Marx and Engels, and you can just do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a perspective from the present that projects itself on the past and pretends there hasn't been historical development. And it's an anti-scientific perspective, like, to be honest, right? Because it assumes that historical materialism has not developed and instead has all the answers once upon a time at a perfect moment of formulation. So when people say that Marxism, Leninism has all the answers, the argument that they're making is no stronger than the people that say just Marx and Engels have all the answers, right? The same justifications can be used for both.
Mm.
So Marxist Leninists who deny the Maoist turn, right? I mean, they do this because they claim, that Maoism has generated no qualitatively significant developments. And what they'll say instead, when you bring up things like mass line, cultural revolution, they'll say, oh, these can be found in the works of Stalin and Lenin, because they'll find the word cultural revolution. Or something like that. And so it's like a few random lines or words here and there. But what they can't do is they cannot point to like a large scale practice. Like, I mean, let's be unequivocal about this. There's no point in the sequence of the Bolshevik Revolution where we witness a large scale embrace of the mass line to the point where the bombardment of the party headquarters was legitimated theoretically, right? The Cultural Revolution explosion, you do not see that. You do not see like Mao basically saying bombard the headquarters. You don't see Stalin saying bombard the headquarters, let alone Lenin. I mean, he died earlier on, but you don't see that, right? So it's not enough to just have these theoretical lines. There's also the practice that makes the theory correct, right? Theory isn't abstract. And we're Marxists. We believe that theory that's a scientific thing as well. I can come up with some weird ass scientific theories of physicists, but unless if I don't prove it in a laboratory, it's just like my musings and things like that. The theory of the mass line, the theory of cultural revolution, we see the practice of those and thing. And so you don't see this moment of this bombarding the headquarters or practice of the mass line at this level, at this theoretized level, in the Bolshevik Revolution and its sequence, right? Instead, what we get with people who claim this is an attempt to claim in retrospect that the same thing existed theoretically in the works of Lenin and Stalin. That's it. But the only reason I would argue that we see the same thing is because we have the further development of the world historical revolution in China and later the systematic conceptualization of Maoism to look back on the period of Leninism and generate theoretical continuity. This goes back to my old talk about continuity earlier on. And similarly, we can find evidence of Lenin's conception of the party or his conception of the state in the work of Marx and Engels, but only because he intervened and organized their work according to his revolutionary practice. So just as Leninism was a development from Marxism, so too is Maoism a development from Leninism. And this is like almost like summing up what we kind of began this discussion with in the science. And so, as I've already indicated, we're dealing with qualitative leaps in theory. From Marxism to Marxism-Leninism, from Marxism-Leninism to Marxism-Leninism, Maoism. These leaps are based on historical revolutions. So from class struggle to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, to class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat. And, as I said earlier, it is the sequence of world historical revolutions that have given us this insight.
Fantastic. Would you mind just clarifying for comrades who maybe for this might be the first time they're hearing about this concept of like world historical revolutions, and I am conscious that there are probably comrades who are listening to this who maybe haven't studied Maoism or who maybe are even quite new to Marxism-Leninism. Would you mind just giving a brief overview of the world historical revolutions, which ones they are specifically?
Yeah, well, I think the two big ones, I mean, I talk about Paris Commune as well, but I would say the two big ones for like our understanding of theory and communism is, I mean, and there's world historical bourgeois revolutions too, right? Like the French Revolution. And then we can say there's world historical revolutions first that have to do with like our understanding of slavery, like the Haitian Revolution. But when I'm talking about like world historical communist revolutions, these are revolutions that, they put on the table new universal understandings that are applicable everywhere, right? And they actually change the face of the world, right? So, and we only have two of these. We have, for specifically communist ones, a big one, the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. And what these did was they brought out new forms of, kind of organizing theory, strategy. So like the Russian Revolution, what it did, because it's the first communist revolution that is like able to establish socialism, right? And it is, and advances to a certain way. And then the communist, the Chinese Revolution does the same thing. It changes the face of the world as well. It's it's the first communist revolution in the global peripheries. That also advances socialism, and it advances further down the road of socialism. It advances to understand the class struggle under socialism and this explosion of the Cultural Revolution. But it does that by implementing what the previous world historical revolution did, this idea that it changes the world. It's this massive revolution that changes the face of the world and gives us these kind of technologies, right? The Vanguard Party, things like that, right? The conception of the state as a machine, the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And so it's able to establish those things, but also bring up new conceptions with what it's doing that, if implemented elsewhere, we'll see people. And so people, I think, only haven't to be a new world historical revolution, it's got to go further than China did. This is China went further than Russia did. Now, I know I'm just like kind of messing around that. I outlined this in much more detail and much better than I can say it spontaneously here in Continuity and Rupture. And I took this notion from Samirman, and he talks about it in, I believe, Class and Nation.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thanks so much. That really clarifies a lot. I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot from it. There's one question that keeps on coming up on this conversation that's coming to mind. I see a couple of people are asking about it in the chat here, and it's particularly pertaining to a cultural revolution. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about cultural revolution, because there's so many misconceptions about cultural revolution, what that is, what that was, how it actually played out. I'm reading the book at the moment, which is kind of clarifying what really happened. It's the Mobo Gao book, The Battle for China's Past. And it's about Maoism and the Cultural Revolution and so on and so forth. And there's just so much misinformation about cultural revolution, what that is, what that entails. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit, just while we're here? I know it's kind of off the cuff, but would you mind just clarifying for people kind of like what we mean when we talk about cultural revolution?
Yeah, I mean, cultural revolution, the argument of that, well, first we go through, one of the things that it's connected to is this notion that, I said earlier, right, class struggle to the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a Leninist kind of notion. And then Maoism claims that class struggle continues under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Therefore, socialism is a class, still a class. This classes still exist there. It's still class struggle. I mean, socialism just means that the proletariat class is supposed to be on the top and the bourgeois on the bottom, right? But because of that, because it's class struggle, the bourgeoisie can always come back, and they don't necessarily come back as like outside agitators, like that kind of way. They come back almost organically within the movement itself, right? These bourgeois relations that, although you may have smashed the material relationship that would give the bourgeoisie its relationship to the point of production, you haven't smashed all the superstructural aspects of it. Right? This is a cultural part of it, right? A lot of these things, you go back to kind of like Mao's On Contradiction, where he talks about the way that the superstructure can obstruct the base. It's kind of that kind of cultural form. There's going to be stuff that's inherited there that when we come into socialism, we don't immediately become new subjects with like a different position. That we come in with still having been socialized according to bourgeois norms, and especially people that came out of the former bourgeois class and things like that. But those ideas and that way of being, the kind of bourgeois way of being, the exploitative that way of being, the individual self-interested subject, these are ways, it's kind of like the dirty clothes that we were still drenched in when we come into socialism, right? Mm-hmm. And so the understanding of a cultural revolution is that there needs to be kind of a revolution in that superstructural sphere to clear out all of these kind of like this ideological conditioning of us in that kind of way. And also that because of this, you may find a new bourgeoisie emerging within the party and reestablishing a connection to the point of production as bourgeoisie, right? Because they have the structures and they still think, well, there's a lot of people do in a bourgeois way. And that's exactly what we saw with, I know, this might annoy some of your listeners, but I'm a Maoist. I'm going to say this is exactly what we saw with like Liu and Deng's line, and that line emerged victorious after the Cultural Revolution. I mean, the Cultural Revolution was an attempt, the struggle against that line, right? To reassert the power of the masses, the creativity of the masses, to bombard the headquarters, to bombard certain bourgeois privileges that were appearing, and create a new socialist human that was not like, that had a different culture, right? Had a different thing than the kind of the bourgeois self that was inherited from capital, not just the bourgeois self. I mean, that would just be the kind of upper class and more privileged people in the Communist Party in China, right? That would inherit that. But also there was like the semi feudal. It was against kind of all the old like pre-capitalist notions that were bad too, like kind of semi feudal notions like Confucianism, all these things that were like anti-mass that had to be overcome, and that installed like old feudal privileges. They still lingered as well. So that's really, there's a lot there again, but hopefully that's a good beginning for people to do it. And I know, Lobo Gao's book is great. I knew another a really enjoyable one to read too about the Cultural Revolution era is Han Suyin's Wind in the Tower. She's also she's a really good novelist too. So when she writes her kind of story of the events of the Cultural Revolution, it's just really beautiful to read. I mean, it was written right at kind of like right after the Cultural Revolution ended, and so she, like a lot of other people, still thinks that like Deng is great and that he had done his self-criticism, and he's broken from Liu. So it's on that, which as we know, and she takes an anti-Gang of Four line because of that at the time. But so did a lot of other anti-revisionist parties at that period of time when she was writing. But up to that point, it's a great historiography of the unfolding story.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that. We're going to take a few more questions now from the chat, if that's okay with you, Josh.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, so people in the chat, if you want to go ahead and just type @Paul Moran and then your questions afterwards, I'll take them down and we'll get to as many of them as we can over the next little while. I think we've got about maybe half an hour, 40 minutes left of your time before we're going overboard. And there's a couple of questions that I have to get through already of people who sent the questions before we went live. They kind of cheated, I suppose, a little bit. So we'll take those. I'll take 2 questions. I see a question is coming here on Super Chat. I'm just going to take that down. That's from JC Rios. We will take that. That'll be the 3rd question that we take. I'm just taking this down so I don't forget. Okay, so just in the meantime, while I'm trying to organize my stuff here, we had a question beforehand from Jolie, who's a big fan of your books. And Jolie asked, what are your thoughts on communist organizations in Canada as they are? What errors have arisen that need to be corrected? And what drew you to the PCR RCP?
Well, I think one of the ones that I kind of went over one of them already. That was the Communist Party of Canada and its poor understanding of settler capitalism, right? I mean, one of the things when I was getting more involved in more drawn to the Maoist line because of like mass movements that were happening over the world. I had a friend that was like a supporter of the Communist Maoist Party of Afghanistan, and he was we had a lot of debates. It was like pushing me towards Maoism. But I mean, one of the big things for me is like, I understood, communists should be connected and doing organizational work in connection somehow with a party, right? And I didn't like the Communist Party of Canada. I already knew that it was a shitty party, in my opinion, and specifically because of the work I had done on anti-colonial theory, which my dissertation was kind of about it was about the philosophy of anti-colonial theory. So I mean, I was grounded in understanding Fanon and all these other people, and understanding stuff with the Indigenous movement. I'd done solidarity work with a number of things with my labor union, going to stuff with the indigenous standoffs and uprisings. And I was like, there's no way I'm gonna ever join a party that doesn't recognize the national self-determination, decolonization of the colonized populations of Canada, and can't understand that. So it's like I already knew that was backwards. And also even just seeing a lot of these parties, the old ones, and there's some other ones, Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, that used to be part of the new communist movement, anti-revisionist, but just turned into another electoral party and became really dogmatically weird with they have a cult of this guy named Hartfield Baines who's set up parties all around the world. He's dead now. But any of them, and a number of other, they just would not really be part of any unfolding struggle, right? They just get people in to run elections and put out their newspaper, and they'd have the Young Communist League, but it would always be a rotating door because people would leave it after it wasn't doing anything, and all that is it's just kind of like I didn't see anything. And then when the the emergence of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Canada, the PCR-RCP from Quebec. I mean, they had lines that I was like, okay, these are like lines that I can see that make sense based on the struggle of the masses. Like they had a line for national self-determination of Indigenous nations, right? That was like a line. That was one of the kind of make or break lines for me for any party in Canada for either being supporting settler colonialism or not. I think that's a make or break in any colonial context, right?
Yeah.
They had that line. They also had a line that that Quebec nationalism was a dead project. And this came out from people that were originally francophones, right? Who came from that background. So, I mean, it was, and then they had a bunch of other stuff in there too, right? About, Maoism and all those other things, right? And then, having seen a lot of when they were starting and having seen the work they were doing, I was impressed by their attitude. Now, I mean, it's been a number of years now, and like a lot of these organizations, so many different line struggles have happened, and there's been splits and resplits and rebuildings and things like that I'm not going to get into. But I mean, the first part is I gravitated towards them because they actually had a concrete analysis of the concrete situation of Canada.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Yeah, I can really resonate with your point on the national question. Just so many communist organizations, especially as you said, very much revisionist organizations, just completely ignore the national question, even to the point of disregarding Stalin's own writings on the Marxism and the national question, which is just, it's really wild. I have people, I've had so many people call me like radlib just for talking about Marxism and the national question, and I'm like, no, I'm literally quoting Stalin right now.
Yeah. No, I know, it's like that. Stalin, and then there's Lenin had a bunch of writings on it. The whole entire Second Congress of the Third International, its biggest section was on the national question. That's what's really worth reading, those notes, because the stuff they say there is so ahead of a lot of the stuff that comes up in modern decolonial literature. It's like they're saying the same shit in Marxist language, and it's like Lenin and all these people talking about it. Except for Trotsky, he really sucks on that issue. In fact, he said the wrong line in that one. That's the line that gets adopted by the Second Congress of the Third International. So, but I think because of the way that kind of settler chauvinism is, or the way that I know I'm going off on this, but it's an interesting topic. It's an important topic, right? Or the way that colonial ideology functions is that there is kind of this people can accept that this stuff was said in the Third International, that Stalin wrote about this. They can say it's correct, but then they can say it doesn't apply to these people because they'll find mechanical ways to do that because of their settler chauvinism. So the common one that's made by revisionists here is that applies to Quebec because Quebec seems to fit mechanically Stalin's qualification of a nation. And then they're like, you know what? Indigenous nations don't fit that qualification. And they usually say that by regurgitating a bunch of racist talking points, right? So they have a way around it, but it's a way that is driven by a settler ideology.
Mm-hmm. We've had the same thing in Ireland. There have been people who've made this question use the exact criteria from Marxism and the national question to basically deny the liberation of Ireland, which is just really because obviously Ireland is still colonized. The occupied 6 counties in the north of Ireland. I mean, it's still a colony. And people just don't kind of talk about that anymore. But there are people who still just kind of who ignore that. And there's actually you talk about Trotsky. There are some Trotskyist organizations in Ireland who are kind of they have this idea that we can reunite Ireland as part of the UK. So United Ireland under. That's
exactly Trotskyists that say that they go to about on and on about Israel and Palestine, and they're like, the solution is the Palestinian and Israeli working class. They'll work together to become a united new Israel.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's so fucking ridiculous. Yes, let's unite under the colonizer's identity, under the colonizer's nationality, whatever it might be. It's really wild stuff. But I can definitely sympathize when you say that that's a really important make or break question for you, because it definitely is for me, and it probably has been one of the reasons why I've become a lot more critical of revisionism as well, because unfortunately a lot of these revisionist organizations are really, really bad on this particular question. Not all of them. There are plenty of Marxist-Leninist organizations who are really, really strong in this, but there are also plenty who unfortunately aren't. So thank you very much. Now, the next question. This is a slightly more heady question. So you might need to... It might be worth actually reading along with this one, because there's a couple of questions contained in it.
Okay,
have a little look at the document, at the Google Doc that I've sent you there. And if you scroll down to audience Q&A, you can see question number 2.
You find a Google Doc, first of all.
Oh.
on the computer.
I can share it with you again. Do you want me to send it on again?
I can find the link. I think you. Okay, where is it?
Let me
You shared it with me before. Here, I'm just going back up where you shared it with me.
just see if I can.
No, that's not it.
Let me just pop it into messages again, and then we'll dive into this one.
I found it.
Oh, you found it. You got there slightly before me. My internet's been kind of slow.
Okay, let me go.
Okay, so
There's this.
are you ready? Have you got it in front of you? Can you see what I'm talking about?
Okay. No, I'm not. This is funky right now.
So it's on page 9 of our little Google Doc here. I've got a few of the questions from the chat there written down here, so we can take them as we go, and we can read along and make sure we're on the same page.
Which number is it?
So this is number 2. This is from Faye, a comrade from the Connolly Youth Movement, and also a big fan of yours. So she's engaged with your work quite a bit, so she has quite a lot to say. So very insightful stuff, maybe a little bit over my head, but let's see if you can handle it. Faye says, you have written about how Deleuze and Guattari were your gateway drug into Marxism. You also praise Althusser frequently in your work. Both these thinkers attempted to critique Hegel and dialectical materialism more broadly in different ways. How should we engage with dialectical materialism? What do you think people like Deleuze's contributions to Marxism could be? How do you think his rejection of dialectics could be useful in combating the often very theological understanding of dialectical materialism among communists, specifically MLs? And what would be the pitfalls in becoming invested in Deleuze or Althusser or even Sartre's critiques of dialectical reasoning for someone invested in the philosophy of Maoism? Love your work. I'm currently writing a painful undergrad paper on Nietzsche, and reading Demarcation and Demystification reminded me why I did my undergrad in philosophy in the first place. From Faye Sarsfield.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, that's a great question. It's a kind of philosophy question that, like, you know, I really dig into in many ways. Just a second, let me just pay attention to it a bit more.
Yeah,
okay,
there's
a
lot to unpack there. Yeah,
there's a lot to unpack. I mean, I can have a really pat answer. It's like, you know what? Maybe those questions will be solved in Demarcation and Demystification, which you're reading. So I should say nothing. Just kidding. They are fully solved in that too. I mean, okay. So first thing I want to say is, like, I can say Deleuze and Guattari were my gateway drug back into, because they were some kind, they were connected to autonomous Marxism circles. But I'm not a Deleuzian anymore, and actually Deleuze and Guattari anymore. And I think their understanding of dialectical materialism is terrible. You know, when I was younger, I thought it was good. And let's just say there's some interesting things to get out of Deleuze and Guattari. There's interesting things in Anti-Oedipus. I think some of the stuff they say in Anti-Oedipus, when they connect stuff to, like, say, there's a part where they connect some of their notions to, like, kind of third world political economy. Specifically, they mentioned Samir Amin. I think that kind of stuff is interesting. But on the whole, I think especially when they hit 1,000 Plateaus, this kind of rhizomatic stuff is just, I feel, like overly philosophical, trying to be really cool new sheep theory bullshit. Fun to read now and then, just to, like, it's always good to read lots of stuff. But, you know, it's the way they talk about Hegel in the dialectic is, you know, is they say, I mean, this is great. I mean, there's a great article back when Badiou was a Marxist-Leninist. He wrote this review of the first chapter of 1,000 Plateaus, and it's called "Of the Potato." I mean, the reason he uses potato is because the rhizom is the root that grows out of the potato, and Deleuze and Guattari are into this rhizomatic thing instead of dialectics, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things he says is that, you know, either based on the way that they conceptualize Hegel in this piece, either they have not read Hegel, or they're liars. And he goes, I wouldn't put it. He goes, Deleuze is important, you know, professor who's gone through all philosophy, so there's no way he hasn't read Hegel. So he implies that, like, they're lying. But he basically says they misrepresent Hegel. So, I mean, I don't think, I mean, be clear, I think it's always good to read people like Deleuze and Guattari. I'm not advocating don't read them. I think all of these radical theorists, there's always something we can learn from them while we run it through the grist of historical materialism and dialectical thinking. I think dialectical thinking is really important. Now, when it comes to Althusser, I'm always very clear on where I stand with Althusser and what I like about Althusser. I think Althusser has, like, a great contribution to how to think of philosophy, right? Think of philosophy as a practice, and how to think of Marxism as a science, right? I think he starts up some great stuff about that. I think his work on ideology is really worthwhile, especially if you connect it with Gramsci and stuff. But I think there's also these problems he has. I mean, he couldn't break from a revisionist party himself, and also he kind of his the stuff he does with the interpolation of the subject kind of opens the door for these kind of post-structuralist Foucauldian notions of the subject, which I don't think are helpful. But I think what's different about Althusser from Deleuze and Guattari is I think it's wrong to say he denies Hegel. What he does is he denies Hegelian Marxism. I think that's important to have that distinction, because what he was dealing with at the time was kind of the type of a rise of a humanist Marxism. That was that kind of Frankfurt School, specifically Sartrean stuff, and Sartrean stuff as well. And I like Sartre here and there for a lot of other stuff, like a lot of his anti-fascist work. But what he was trying to deal with was this notion that, you had to read Hegel in order to understand Marx, that the dialectic was the same as the dialectic in Hegel. And so he thought you should take seriously this notion, of stripping the dialectic from its mystical shell that Marxism had. And he also wanted to kind of connect this notion that the young Marx was much more of a Hegelian, was influenced by the logic of dialectics that he gained from Hegel, but was no longer a Hegelian, right? He was a materialist, an idealist. And I think that kind of insight was important in what he was trying to bring. But he himself admitted that he perhaps bent the stick too far in the other direction in order to correct it, right? That was a quote, he quoted Lenin about some stuff. So, I mean, I think that's important too to understand. So we go back to kind of what are the pitfalls? Well, the pitfalls is you can get so much into reading these people that you start seeing them as kind of the really new thing, and drifting away from kind of that concrete analysis of a concrete situation, right? And drifting away from the idea that this stuff is connected to practice. They're all worth reading, though, and I think it is worth always combating a theological understanding of dialectical materialism. I mean, we're supposed to be about being, the science, the revolutionary science, not like revolutionary religion. And there's kind of a way that people talk about dialectics that's not even dialectical. They'll just say that's dialectical, or they'll just throw the buzzwords around, right? Yep. And so I think it's important to kind of learn from these traditions and read the work by Marxists on dialectics as well, like good, people, go back to Lukács, go back to Marx and Engels, and all that kind of stuff, and kind of come up with that understanding as well. And I think there's so much more I could say to that, but I could go on forever, so I'll end it there.
Thank you very much. There's one thing you do very well. You take very complex ideas and you sort of process them and make them a little bit more easily digestible for the layman, which is kind of where I'd find myself there, because it made sense when you were saying it. I was trying to decipher that question when the many questions that were there beforehand, and I was really struggling with them. So that's something that you do very well. And that also comes out in your text as well. So for people in the chat there, please go ahead and read JMP's works, because demystifying is the name of the game. He does it very, very well. It adds some much needed clarity to some often very, very seemingly complex phenomena, we'll say. Thank you very much, Josh. I appreciate that. Now, the next question we had is from JC Rios. Has Professor Moufawad-Paul read China's Green Revolution? That's the title, Read China's Green Revolution. And why is anarchism so popular and much more active in Canada and America on the far left? So the popularity of anarchism in America and Canada, and Read China's Green Revolution.
I haven't read China's Green Revolution. It's on my reading list, but it's anything. My reading list keeps growing. That's keep going. I haven't read that. I can't say anything about that.
Okay.
As for why is anarchism more popular and active in Canada and America on the far left, I think it's just because a number of things. There's a number of things. The weakness of communism. It's how it was kind of basically destroyed through kind of Cold War within the centers of imperialism, and the fact that the labor aristocracy was able to squeeze out and destroy the communist movement in those spaces. Also, the communists there after the new communist movement, and when that fell with the fall of Eastern Bloc and things like that, and the decay of the new communist movement, just the way that there was no one, the communists weren't at the forefront of organizing struggles, right? And so anarchism kind of seeped in there. It's kind of a way that, remember, if you think of that kind of Lenin's claim about anarchism being, left opportunism, or, this kind of left communism having to do with the sins of opportunism, it moves in there because of the problems of opportunism that just makes a whole bunch of people just not like Marxism for a whole bunch of reasons, right?
That's actually a really good point. And actually, it's kind of something that I feel like we're bumping up against right now. I've actually seen this a lot of a lot of communists online who would have been MLs beforehand. They're bumping up against some of the issues that we've talked about a little bit here today, and rather than going forwards, confronting them and moving beyond them, they're kind of going backwards or scattering into a million different directions. So you have people going back to being like orthodox Marxists. You have people taking on left-gone positions, becoming like reading like Bordig and stuff like that. You have people becoming anarchists or becoming this or that or the other. And it's getting very, very eclectic. It's rather than going forward, it seems to be kind of going backwards or going in like any other direction other than forwards. And I think that this is something that we need to confront and deal with. There are paths forward, and we need to make them very clear for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, JC Rios, for the question. The next question we have here is from Jessidiah. Paul Marin, would the professor agree that once there is another significant change in the international revolutionary movement, then MLM will also be integrated into the new ISM MLM? I assume this is asking the question, like, will we like add on a new layer, like a new qualitative leap forwards?
And I say yes. I talk about that in Continuity and Rupture. If there's a new historical revolution that goes further than Maoism, and if it is not the one that gets us to communism, right? And it fails, and there has to be an apprehension of that failure and the construction of a new notion of revolutionary communism to take us even further, then yeah, there would probably be some theoretical movement that is based on what that revolution was and the forces that led it, that would be a new development. Revolutionary science is only going to end as revolutionary science, not the historical materialism part of it, but when you reach kind of a classless society. We're not there yet, so yeah.
Absolutely. We're going to have the MLM alphabet soup at some stage. At some stage, we're just going to have to say revolutionary communist. Be done with it, I think.
I know. That's what I like to say, but the problem is the reason we use these is because we have to clarify what we mean, because there's so many people that claim revolutionary communist. So it's like, the reality is the truth is we should just call it revolutionary communist. And this is how it's developed through these sequences. But we're stuck with naming tendencies because there's so many shitty tendencies out there as well. or not so shitty either, but different ones too.
Yeah, no, this is the demarcation, I suppose. Thank you. And also another question from Jessica. She also asked, would you say that cultural revolution could only be successful when already in socialism? Actually, do you have any thoughts about cultural revolution prior to socialism? Are there any ways that we can bring that in?
Like this is, I think cultural revolution, the struggle of a cultural revolution in that one sense, if we just look at it by definition, that kind of struggle would happen under socialism, because it's about class struggle under socialism. But having kind of the mindset of trying to carry out cultural revolution in the revolutionary movement to kind of like reform bourgeois behaviors, rectify all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I argue like one of the good things about the Nepal revolution brought to the table before they fucked up was they had this notion that cultural revolution should start earlier within like revolutionary sequences, and there should be struggles going on with party leadership already, right? And I think that's part of what our new understanding of Maoism is now too, the ability to rectify leadership, to like hold leadership accountable to the mass membership and things like that. These are all parts of having a cultural revolution sensibility, and that would actually probably make that class struggle under socialism more weighted on the side of the masses.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I can definitely think of some examples where such an approach would be a lot more beneficial moving forward than the current approach being followed. So thank you very much. Moving on from there, the next question I see is Alejandro, who says, Paul, could you speak on the principally Maoist sect of Maoism and their criticism of your work? Any thoughts on that, Josh? Principally Maoism? That was cheeky. That was cheeky asking about criticisms of your work there.
I already kind of spoke about their criticism of my work when I was in the interview, when I talked about being accused of having a theory of rupture. Like one of the things they say about my work, whenever they engage with it a lot, not all the principally Maoist types, but I want to say the majority of them, especially the US-based ones, not all of them either, but some of them, is they'll say this stuff about how my work, I've proposed a doctrine of pure rupture. They'll say weird stuff like that the terms continuity and rupture don't appear anywhere except with the Afghans or something like that. And of course, I mean, I read a passage out earlier from Mao. Mao actually talks a lot about it, a number of things, and also Lenin spoke about it as well. So that's what I mean. So I've always clarified that I'm not about the doctrine of pure rupture. The other thing they say about my work is that I'm opposed to the concept of the vanguard party, because I used the term mass party in continuity rupture, but I was using it cheekily, kind of to undermine the notion of Rosa Luxemburg's notion of the mass party, to say that the vanguard party, the mass line, could truly be a mass party. Not that it was that conception, but they use that as well. And so I've always argued that they've misrepresented my work and what I said. And I think the work speaks for itself. It's like there's only so many times I can say that I do believe in the concept of the vanguard party and write about it after they keep saying I don't. Like, what do you say to that? I mean, and other than that, I don't want to speak too much about them. I mean, I wrote about that tendency in Critique of Maoist Reason, and I think that a lot of this is just I don't want to get into that kind of those kind of the sectarian stuff that is encouraged by that as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, being the bigger man here.
Well, I don't know about that, but maybe just being exhausted man.
Yeah. Maybe a fight for another day. And it's all there anyway in Critique of Maoist Reason, so people can check that out if they're curious. And again, link below in the description box if people want to go ahead and check that out. And I think it's, as you said, I think it's foreign language press, so people can check out the PDF as well for free if they would like. So thank you very much. Moving on from there, the next one is from VV. Paul Maron. Ask him about his thoughts on Kaipakaya. Kaipakaya's theoretical work. I'm probably mispronouncing that really, really badly. I think it's TKP-ML, the Turkish communist revolutionary. Ibrahim Kaipakaya. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation.
Ibrahim Kaipakaya. Yeah. I love his work. I think his work is great. It's like essential to like the development of the Marxist-Leninist Maoist tradition, and his work on the national question is essential reading. Like, I think a lot of people reading about the national question, they stop at Stalin, and I mean, and that's how you get these mechanical applications. That book is like, it's like 100 years old, almost 100 years old, right? And you need like the developments of a theory of the national question since. And I think one of the things Kaipakaya did was with his work on the national question, specifically in his context in Turkey with the Kurdish national question, it develops that conception further, as does Miriategi's work on the national question. So, I mean, I think it's like this stuff, like Kaipakaya is great. And his thoughts, I think Kaipakaya's theoretical work is great. And also he was very, important revolutionary in our tradition. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Next up is Tom. We'll take maybe two more after this, and I think we will probably wrap things up. I don't want to keep you too much and exhaust you. But Tom asks, or Tom states to start here, JMP suggested that orthodox Marxism-Leninism line, that the orthodox Marxist-Leninist line was that class struggle ended at the dictatorship to proletariat, not that it intensified. Why? Stalin said that it can't but lead to the inevitable sharpening of the class struggle. I mean, I do think there's a lot of talk about this. Like Lenin would have talked about this as well a little bit. Would you like to say any words on that or clarify? Or?
It's like I said earlier. It's like it's not theorized. Stalin does not theorize, aside from the lines, the way that like the carrying out of class struggle exists under the dictatorship of the proletariat, and how the dictatorship of the proletariat is a situation of class struggle. In fact, his understanding of class struggle in that ends up being very international. Like, how did Stalin understand what was happening in the dictatorship of the proletariat? Largely because look at all of, not Stalin, but the entire leadership. Because I hated all these when it's connected to like a single person. That entire perspective was, they saw it, and you can see this, you can even read this in Foundations of Leninism and all these other kinds of things. They see it as outside influenced, right? Outside influenced, and it's like, it's not that it could organically be their own class contradictions within it, and that's why you do not see Stalin ever thinking that that it would accrue within the party itself, right? Or that you would have to have a class struggle between the masses and the party. There's no systematized thinking about that. So it's again, this kind of view is saying that, well, because we find this line in there, and Stalin said this line here and there, right? Just like Lenin did or someone else, this is actually a theoretical understanding of class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Stalin literally does not see the dictatorship of the proletariat as one that is a class. Socialism is not classed. He doesn't see it as a class structure. When he talks about class struggle, He's just talking about the struggle to defend the Soviet Union against the rest of the world. In fact, you can see this kind of notion about why Stalin didn't see it as a class structure, because he thought that there could be something called proletarian law, right? In this kind of way, that in this notion that there was no bourgeois still in a society, right? And this was something that was carried on in the struggles around legal Soviet Marxism that people like Pashup-Canis were involved in. So I mean, that's why I think it's like, if you find these like small kind of statements and things like that, you're not looking at a theory, right? You're not looking at a systematized theory. We're talking about theoretical development, right? Not statements here and there. But of course, these statements are insights that in retrospect are insights that are like, this justifies in retrospect this theoretical development, things like that. Okay.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Frederico Manuel Oliveira asks, let me see, I think it's phrased slightly strangely. But I think the meaning of the question is, ask about the main differences between imperialism of central powers and Soviet social imperialism. Would you mind speaking a little bit to that?
Oh man, I mean, this is an old debate that goes back to this. I think it's a dead debate right now, because I think it only matters in some areas, right? And I think largely has nothing to do with how we organize right now. It more has to do with like having fights with like Khrushchevites and Brezhnevites still, or something like that. I mean, there were differences. I think that a lot of time the new communist movement, people flattened them out too much, and that's why you had terrible views like the October League had, that Soviet social imperialism was worse than American imperialism, which is ludicrous, right? It's a revisionist Soviet party it's still imperialist. But it's not the same thing as like the full-out capitalist one, though it's going down that road, right? And there's definitely differences between the Soviet revisionist period of time versus like the glasnost period and the total end that we have now in the former Soviet Union, right? But what I will say is that it does, in some contexts, it does matter when people when people try to say that Soviet social imperialism doesn't matter as much. I mean, and it's if you look at Afghanistan, the entire organization of the movement, the socialist movement there, kind of falls down on this question. And there's people. The PDPA was a Soviet puppet government, and people now who like to talk about Brezhnev try to argue that it was good and just, and the Soviet invading was good, and the Maoists were bad. Some of the Maoists, like the ALA, were shit because they fought on the side of the U.S. But the majority of the Maoist movement was just kind of caught between those two things. The PDPA did not have any organic connections, and in fact, the PDP, well, you can understand them now too, is that the former people of PDPA now are really pro the American occupation. They're not people any good. Also, is the ALO actually. They both get together in the parliament. Things. So, I mean, seeing kind of the way that Soviet social imperialism, a kind of invasion, carried itself out in Afghanistan, making a distinction between that and imperialist central powers. In some ways, it was important at the time, right? Because if you said they were completely different, then you would choose one over the other. But if you saw them as both imperialists in there, then you would say, well, maybe we should see both as like terrible being in here, right? Those are my muddled thoughts on this, because I mean, I'm not a political economist, right? This is not my area, and this is in many ways, I think, is, aside from recognizing the Soviets did do this, right? That they did act in an imperialist kind of way. Figuring out the distinction between capitalist imperialism and Soviet social imperialism, that's not my strong suit. I know other people that are good at that. I should be asking instead of trying to answer that.
Well, thanks for having a go at it anyway and giving it a shot. Have a go, hero, as they say. So thank you very much for that. Just two more questions, and then I'll let you go. You'll be free after that. Don Lokushla asks, Paul, I'd like to know, how broad does he think a party should be? Should it try to accommodate various communist strands, such as ML or MLM, or even other tendencies? And in brackets here, he has shitty ones, etc. So should we be trying to hoover up the orthodox Marxists, the Trotskyists, and all these kinds of people? What do you think?
No, I mean, it's not a party. It's not a partisan party anymore. I mean, the party of a vanguard has to have a specific program that is theoretically united on a specific kind of tendency. Once you start extending it, you end up with exactly what has been one of the major problems and stumbling blocks of new regroupment communist projects. And they all fall apart. These like big tent socialisms, where they try to get every tendency in it together, but it never works because they all fight, and they always end up with the lowest level of unity, right?
Yeah.
The lowest level of unity that is not even an advanced position. And instead they end up being like a united front trying to be a party,
Mm.
right? So what I think, and it's like, you can have a theoretically principally united party that is not sectarian in the way that it engages, but it should have a program. It should have a program that has its ideology clear so that people who are in it unite around that. But it should also be one that is willing to recognize that it can be in united fronts with other parties that are based on certain kind of things, not reactionary stuff, not reactionary parties, obviously, other, and be, and be part of those united fronts in a principled way, not as like asshole sectarians. And that if their line is correct amongst the masses, then people will gravitate towards it. And they can, also have mass organizations where people from other tendencies can participate as well, and have an autonomous kind of level too, where they can participate and struggle it out. But a party formation, a vanguard party formation, should be united around a specific programmatic ideology. That's the way it's always been. That's the kind of the view we have from that. The distinction that we have with Maoism is this notion of mass work and mass organizations and stuff that can broaden the party's circumference.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, got to implement those three magic weapons, as they say, and be sure to carefully distinguish between them. Thank you very much. Last question, kind of a fun one. Take it or leave it, But Libya Jamaria asks, Paul, I know this is highly unrelated, but I promised I would ask JMP on Twitter. What are JMP's thoughts on Muammar Gaddafi?
Oh my God. I mean, he's not a communist. He wasn't a communist, right? Now, I can say that he was an anti-imperialist, and as anyone, we recognize the struggle of oppressed nations against nations, but he wasn't a communist, and in fact, it's very clear, and he definitely wasn't a Maoist. And so, no, he wasn't. He never, in the Green Book, he never calls himself that. He would never say that in his real life, and it's not. He was an anti-imperialist person that would sponsor some leftist groups and things like that. He also had a bit of, there's stuff that I have a friend from the Middle East who grew up in Libya, and he always had funny stories about how kind of weird Gaddafi was too, not in like an evil way that is being painted by the media, but just like how eclectic he was and things like that. That's a different story altogether. But Gaddafi, Gaddafi is not, and also Gaddafi at one time in the 80s, he sponsored this this third positionist kind of, not third positionist. Third positionist was something else. Sorry, I forget what it's called. It had the word third in it, but it was where he thought that this common front against imperialism, where he also would invite fascists to be part of it as well.
Red, brown, and
right.
stuff.
So in there, I know people from that generation who were went there and they're like, what the fuck are these fascists doing here, right? It was all because they're against imperialism, right? And that kind of. That he sponsored, it was just a phase maybe he was going through, but there's a period of time where he sponsored a Red-Brown alliance. And the people that really get into Gaddafi are the ones that always end up walking away from communism, in my position, right? So for example, the Communist Party Canada Marxist-Leninist is hugely into Gaddafi, or was. Gaddafi's dead now. And they're a weird group. And there's these other people like that, the guy that used to be in the Workers' World Party that's Caleb Maupin, who was really into Gaddafi and then really into Iran and things like
this guy.
That's the kind of eclectic view that it has. But I am a communist and I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Gaddafi's not, right? And he doesn't have that. What he was, though, is he was an anti-imperialist. And I think that, in the many contradictions that we support anti-imperialist struggle against imperialism. So, of course, when the U.S. invaded Gaddafi, of course, that was heinous. Of course, the murder of Gaddafi was heinous and the overthrow, just in the other ways of other people that resemble parts of the national struggle of oppressed nations against imperialism. And it was admirable that Gaddafi led an anti-imperialist nation for so long. And then those are my thoughts.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I know that the comrade who asked that is quite a big fan of Gaddafi, and also very into MLM. So I hope they are not too hurt.
MLM, and then it'll change my mind.
Listen, thank you so much. I think we'll sort of wind things down there. We're sort of approaching the 2-hour mark. Would you like to shout out anything that you're working on at the moment before we finish up, whether that's upcoming writing, political events, or anything else?
Oh yeah, I can shout out a number of things. It'll be a while before I get some things out because of pandemic. Well, I mean, I was working. I've been working on this long-standing manuscript about economism, and it started going through the process with a company right before pandemic hit, and now it's all slowed down because of that. The company was shuttered temporarily because of pandemic, right? And then it picked up in the fall, but it's like backlogged. So that long promised one is taking a while to do that. Maybe it'll hope finally see the light of day. And then, I've been working on an extended essay that, it turned into a small book-sized manuscript about the category of the subject. I don't know what to do with that. It may be too philosophy and not enough. But I mean, I guess the one thing I say is like, I'm also part of a collaborative manuscript, and I'm not going to say too much about what it is, but a number of authors. And we're having a meeting tonight to figure out what to do with it. But so those are kind of the things.
Building anticipation.
Yeah. Just for kind of other things. So political events. I mean, I should just say public political events. There's the Foreign Languages Press event with Ajit on February 27th and 28th. And you can check that out on their website to see it. And it was based on this whole idea where people read one of his pieces, The Vanguard of the 21st Century, and then went about had separate reading groups and are submitting questions for this event. And I was in one of the reading groups too here in the Toronto context. So that's on February 27th and 28th. And the details of that are on the Foreign Language Press's website. And I'm supposed to participate somehow as a moderator of some kind, but I'm not. I agreed to it way back, and I can't remember what I agreed to. It'll be a surprise. It's great because Ajit is one of. I think he's one of the significant living revolutionary theorists of Maoism, right? So I'm honored to be part of that. But also, I mean, outside of political events, the one thing I will plug is like, this is a pandemic. One thing is like been stuck in home, working and all that, is that we need escapist social outlets too. So, I'll confess, this will just because I think, if anyone has any kind of like aura, still has an aura of mystique around me, I feel it should be punctured. And know that, in some ways I'm a nerd. And one of the things I like doing is I've been watching this for now probably like 8 or 9 months. Every Monday, there's a Twitch stream of people that play the live Dungeons and Dragons, but it's a Spelljammer one they've done. And and what's cool about it is they're all comedians. They're stand-up comedians who, have are trying to do this in the meantime of being home. And it's live every Mondays at, I guess I think it's 7 Pacific time, and it's called Better Than Heroes, and I am even wearing the shirt.
That was a smooth pan down, by the way.
As soon as I was wearing this shirt down here, I was like, maybe I should plug it just for laughs, so people can be at the end of the day. But it's of these things to do in pandemic. It's a really great thing to watch. I mean, the story's advanced pretty far at this point, but it's funny. The actors are great. The guy that leads it, the dungeon master Harlan, they are also were led one for the indie rock label Jaguar. So it's like it's great stuff. And I won't say any more of that because I'll just end up blabbering and making myself appeal more nerdy. Yeah.
Humanizing yourself. That's what you're doing here. You're human. You're making yourself more approachable.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if he's just a nerd.
Oh, listen.
Dragons in elementary school and high school. Then at the end of high school, I stopped. It was like not respectable anymore.
Oh, listen, comrade, thank you so much. This has been absolutely great. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to come on and educate all of us. This has been hugely helpful for me, and I know it's going to have been hugely helpful for all the comrades who've been watching too. Thank you to everybody for tuning into this interview. Hopefully you found it useful. If you haven't already, then go ahead and pick up a copy of JMP's excellent books, which you'll find linked in the description box below. Also check out his blog, MLM Mayhem, linked below too. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow him at MLM_Mayhem. Comrades, thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Cheers. August Slán go fóill. Bye.